My name is Ezekiel Voss. I'm a wildlife conservation officer who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When volcanic ash blocked the sun and temperatures plummeted to -60, I watched our world freeze solid. I've killed to survive. I've been betrayed. I've seen things that haunt me. This is how I stayed alive when billions didn't. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I should have seen it coming. That's what haunts me most when I think back to those first few days. All the signs were there if I'd been paying attention. The elk migrating 6 weeks early, the unusual cloud formations, the birds going silent. As a wildlife conservation officer at Glacier National Park, I was trained to read nature's warnings. But some warnings are too big to comprehend until it's too late. My name is Ezekiel Voss. My friends called me Zeke back when I had friends. I spent 12 years working these mountains, first with the Coast Guard rescue team, then as a conservation officer. I knew every trail, every ridge, every seasonal pattern in this wilderness. Or I thought I did. Nature has a way of humbling you. I'm recording this because information is going to be the most valuable resource in this new world. If you're watching this, you've survived somehow. Maybe what I learned in those first 30 days can help you last another 30. Or maybe you're watching this years from now, trying to piece together how our civilization collapsed so quickly. Either way, this is my testimony. October 15th, 2027. Just another day in the park for me. I was out checking wolverine traps in the northeastern section, collecting data for our population study. Beautiful fall day, clear skies, temperature in the low 40s. Normal. The radio had been buzzing all morning with reports about volcanic activity in the Pacific. The Ring of Fire was living up to its name with simultaneous eruptions in Japan, Indonesia, and Chile. Unusual, but nothing that concerned me directly, thousands of miles away in Montana. I remember thinking it might make for some spectacular sunsets in the coming weeks as the ash hit the upper atmosphere. That's all it meant to me then. A prettier sky. By afternoon, the emergency broadcasts started. The eruptions were far more severe than initially reported. Preliminary models were showing potential atmospheric effects, cooling trends, possible disruption to global weather patterns, but you know how the news exaggerates everything these days. Or used to, I guess. So I just kept hiking, kept checking my traps. I should have paid more attention to the animals. The wolverines were nowhere to be found, despite this being their active season. The elk herds were moving south fast, not grazing but traveling with purpose. Even the insects seemed to have vanished. The forest felt wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still, like everything was holding its breath. When I got back to my cabin that evening, the sky had taken on a yellowish tint. My satellite phone had 17 missed messages from park headquarters. The first signs of panic. Temperatures across the Pacific Northwest had dropped 15 degrees in a matter of hours. Meteorologists were detecting massive atmospheric changes. The ash cloud was reflecting solar radiation back into space at rates that defied all their models. I still didn't get it. I remember heating up a can of beef stew on my little propane stove, thinking this would all blow over. Maybe we'd have an early winter. Maybe tourists would cancel their trips. Meanwhile, the entire climate system of our planet was coming unraveled. That night, the temperature fell to 8 degrees. In mid-October, a 60-degree drop in less than 24 hours. I woke up to frost covering the inside of my windows. The pipes were frozen. When I tried the radio, I got nothing but static and fragments of emergency broadcasts. Words like unprecedented and global and evacuation, cutting through the interference. Still, I told myself this was temporary, a freak weather event. I'd seen cold snaps before. This one was just earlier and more severe than most. I layered up and went outside to check my thermometer. -12. I'd never seen it drop that low this early in the season. The park superintendent radioed at noon. All visitors were being evacuated immediately. Non-essential personnel were to follow once the visitors were clear. A skeleton crew, including myself, would remain to secure facilities and ensure all hikers were accounted for. Standard emergency protocol. We'd done similar operations for wildfire threats. I spent that day helping panicked tourists pack up their campsites. Their breath fogged thick in the air as they rushed to their vehicles, many wearing every piece of clothing they'd brought. The exodus clogged the park roads. Marcus sat slumped against a tree, our stolen supplies scattered around him in the snow. A large military-style backpack leaned against his side. He clutched his chest where a significant bloodstain had spread across his jacket. The knife fight with Evan had clearly left him seriously wounded. He saw me approach and managed a pained laugh. "Figured someone would follow," he gasped. "Didn't think you'd catch up this fast." I kept my rifle trained on him as I approached. "Those supplies belong to the group. People who trusted you." He coughed, bringing up blood that froze almost instantly on his beard. "Trust gets you killed in this new world. Walter's a fool, waiting around for consensus while supplies dwindle. And your plan was better? Stealing food and leaving injured companions to die." Marcus gestured weakly at his wound. "Worked out great, as you can see." His breathing was becoming more labored. "Doesn't matter now. Take the food back if you want. I won't be needing it." I could see he was right. He had hours at most, even with medical intervention that I couldn't provide here. Still, I wasn't about to leave him to freeze to death, however deserved that might seem. "I'm taking you back with the supplies," I told him, beginning to gather the scattered items. "You'll answer to the group." He laughed again, a wet, rattling sound. "No, you're not. Storm's closing in. We'd both die trying." He gestured to the backpack beside him. "Besides, you don't know what I found." Something in his tone made me pause. I approached cautiously and opened the pack, keeping one eye on Marcus. Inside was a satellite phone, military-grade by the look of it, along with maps and what appeared to be classified documents. "Where did you get these?" I demanded. "Wasn't just supplies I was after," he admitted. "Found a downed military helicopter about 2 miles east. Pilot dead, but his gear intact. That phone still works. Called for extraction before the battery died." I stared at him in shock. "You made contact? With who? Military? Some colonel?" Gave him our coordinates. Marcus's eyes were becoming unfocused. "Said they'd send someone. Have to wait at the extraction point. That's where I was headed." I examined the map from the pack. It showed our position and, marked in red, what I assumed was the extraction point, a natural clearing about 3 miles further east where a helicopter could potentially land. "When?" I pressed. "When are they coming?" But Marcus didn't answer. His eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky. I checked his pulse. Nothing. He was gone. I faced a critical decision: return to the station with the recovered supplies, or proceed to the extraction point on the slim chance that Marcus had actually made contact and help was coming. The storm was intensifying. If I didn't start back soon, I might not make it at all. I looked at the map again. The extraction point wasn't far. If there was even a slight possibility of outside contact, of a way out of this frozen hell, I had to investigate. I gathered the most essential supplies, the satellite phone and the maps. I'd have to leave the rest and hope to retrieve it later. As I stood to continue east, the wind suddenly shifted. Through a momentary break in the blowing snow, I glimpsed something impossible. The strange three-pronged tracks again, perfectly spaced, leading directly toward the extraction point Marcus had identified. I followed those mysterious tracks toward the extraction point, fighting through intensifying snow and wind. The cold had reached a level where exposed skin would freeze in under a minute. My eyelashes crusted with ice that I had to periodically break away to maintain vision. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. The three-pronged tracks remained perfectly spaced and even, undisturbed by the wind that was rapidly erasing all other signs of passage. They seemed impossible. No animal I knew made such marks, and no human device I'd ever seen would leave such consistent impressions in these conditions. Yet there they were, leading me forward like some bizarre breadcrumb trail. Night had fully descended, but the snow reflected what little light remained, creating an eerie gray illumination that allowed limited visibility. I checked my watch, just past 7 in the evening on day 17 of the freeze. I'd been away from the ranger station for nearly 10 hours. Reed would have made it back with the injured Evan by now, assuming they hadn't encountered trouble. The extraction point identified on Marcus's map was a natural clearing on a plateau overlooking what used to be a river valley. As I approached, the wind suddenly died, creating one of those strange silent pockets that sometimes form in the heart of winter storms. The sudden absence of howling wind was almost as disorienting as its presence had been. In that silence, I heard it, a mechanical whirring, faint but growing louder. I crouched behind a snow-covered boulder, unsure if I was heading toward salvation or danger. The sound grew clearer, not the deep thrum of helicopter rotors as I'd expected, but something higher-pitched and more rhythmic. I peered around the boulder toward the clearing. The three-pronged tracks led directly to its center, where an object sat on the snow that had definitely not been created by nature. A metallic tripod stood about 4 feet high, with a rotating beacon on its top emitting a soft blue light. The 3 legs of the tripod matched the mysterious tracks perfectly. This was no animal sign I'd been following, but some kind of automated device that had deployed these beacons. Military technology, perhaps, or something else entirely. The implications sent a chill through me separate from the cold. I remained hidden, watching the beacon. Was this the extraction point Marcus had mentioned? If so, where were the rescuers? I checked the satellite phone from his pack again, but without knowing its protocols or frequencies, it remained useless in my hands. After 20 minutes of observation with no sign of aircraft or other arrivals, I made a decision. I needed to approach the beacon. It was clearly man-made, clearly deployed recently, and might be my only connection to the outside world. I emerged from cover and approached cautiously, rifle ready. As I drew within 10 feet of the tripod, the blue light suddenly intensified, bathing the clearing in azure illumination. A metallic voice emerged from the device. "Proximity alert. Please state identification." I hesitated, then replied, "Ezekiel Voss, Wildlife Conservation Officer, Glacier National Park." Silence for a moment, then, "Identification not recognized. Please state military or government authorization code." I had no such code, of course, but Marcus had supposedly made contact using the satellite phone. I tried. "I'm responding to an extraction request made by Marcus Kellner. He's dead." I found his satellite phone and followed his map to this location. Another pause, longer this time. The blue light pulsed rhythmically. Finally, "Temporary authorization granted pending verification. Please remain in position. Extraction vehicle approaching. Estimated arrival 15 minutes. My heart raced. Someone was coming. Whether military, government, or something else remained to be seen. But the prospect of rescue after 17 days in this frozen hell was overwhelming. I fought to maintain focus. 15 minutes in these temperatures required shelter or movement to prevent hypothermia. I stamped my feet and swung my arms, keeping blood flowing while maintaining visual contact with the beacon. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. The storm continued around the clearing's perimeter, but, strangely, seemed unable to penetrate the area immediately surrounding the tripod. Some kind of field effect? Technology I couldn't begin to understand. Exactly 14 minutes after the announcement, I heard it. Not the expected helicopter, but a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air in the clearing shimmered like a heat mirage, though the temperature remained brutally cold. A vehicle appeared, not gradually descending from above, but simply materializing in the center of the clearing as if a veil had been lifted. It resembled a military transport, but with no visible rotors or jets. Sleek, black, with strange protrusions along its hull that might have been weapons or sensors. This wasn't standard military hardware. This was something beyond my experience. For the first time, I considered that approaching the beacon might have been a serious mistake. Before I could retreat, a ramp descended from the craft's side. Two figures emerged wearing what looked like advanced environmental suits, not the bulky cold-weather gear I was accustomed to, but streamlined outfits that seemed to emit a faint glow. Their faces were obscured behind darkened visors. They approached with practiced efficiency, moving with ease despite the cold that had reduced me to labored movement. One spoke, voice distorted by their helmet. "Marcus Kellner?" "Dead," I replied, keeping my rifle lowered but ready. "About 2 miles west. I'm Ezekiel Voss, Wildlife Conservation Officer." The figures exchanged glances. One touched a control on their wrist, apparently communicating with the craft. After a moment, they addressed me again. "You have Kellner's satellite phone and materials." I nodded cautiously. "Some of it. The rest is with his body. You will take us to retrieve the body and remaining materials," the figure stated. "Not a request, an order." "First, tell me who you are," I demanded. "What branch of military? What's happening with this weather catastrophe?" The figures paused, seeming to consult with each other or perhaps with someone via their communication systems. Finally, one responded. "We are with Project Greenhouse, a joint military scientific response unit. That is all you need to know at present." Project Greenhouse, the same term I'd heard on the emergency broadcasts. This was real, organized, and far more advanced than I'd imagined possible. "There are survivors at a ranger station about 8 miles west," I told them. "People who need evacuation, medical attention." "Our mission parameters are specific," replied the figure, tone flat. "We are to retrieve Kellner and the classified materials only. Others will be processed through standard evacuation protocols." "What standard protocols? We've had no contact, no help for over 2 weeks while temperatures dropped to lethal levels," I argued, anger rising despite my precarious position. The second figure, silent until now, interjected, "The situation evolved more rapidly than anticipated. Civilian response infrastructure was overwhelmed. Military and scientific resources were prioritized for key objectives." "Key objectives like what?" I pressed. "While people froze to death by the millions?" "Project Greenhouse," they replied simply, as if that explained everything. "Now, you will take us to Kellner's body, or we will find it ourselves and leave you here." The implication was clear. Cooperate or be abandoned again in this frozen wasteland. I hadn't survived 17 days in hell to die now from pride. I nodded reluctantly. "I'll take you to him." They provided me with what appeared to be a thermal blanket, but was far more effective than any emergency gear I'd encountered before. Within seconds of wrapping it around my shoulders, warmth penetrated my frozen body for the first time in days. The technology gap between my survival efforts and their equipment was staggering. We trekked back to Marcus's body, the two figures moving easily through snow that had me struggling despite their apparent assistance. They said nothing during the journey, ignoring my questions about the broader situation, other survivors, or long-term plans for the catastrophe. Upon reaching Marcus, they efficiently collected his remains and all scattered supplies, placing everything in specialized containers. They paid particular attention to the documents and electronic devices, securing these in what looked like shielded cases. As we returned to their craft, I tried one more time. There are good people at that ranger station. A park ranger, a military policeman, civilians. They have skills, knowledge. They deserve rescue as much as whatever was in those documents. The lead figure paused, then touched their wrist control again, apparently consulting with someone. After a moment, "Coordinates of the ranger station?" I provided them as precisely as I could, hope flickering that I might have secured help for the others. Back at the craft, they motioned for me to enter the ramp. The interior was surprisingly spacious and maintained at a normal temperature despite the external cold. Various equipment lined the walls, most unrecognizable to me. Marcus's body had been placed in some kind of containment unit. One of the figures removed their helmet, revealing a woman in her 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I am Colonel Helena Wright, Project Greenhouse Emergency Response Division. You've been approved for temporary extraction and debriefing." "Temporary?" I questioned. "All civilian encounters are processed according to protocol," she replied cryptically. "Your assistance in recovering valuable assets has been noted." Before I could ask more questions, the craft began to move. There was no sensation of acceleration, just a slight hum, and the visual confirmation through a small viewport that we were rapidly leaving the ground. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Rocky Mountain Arsenal," Colonel Wright answered. "Emergency Shelter Delta. You'll be debriefed there, and decisions made about your disposition." My mind raced. The same location mentioned in the emergency broadcast. It was real. Organized survival efforts were underway. But the clinical way these people operated, their prioritization of assets over human lives, their advanced technology deployed selectively while millions died, it all suggested something more complex than simple disaster response. As the craft accelerated, I caught a glimpse through the viewport of the world below. The familiar landscape of Montana was transformed into an alien white expanse, broken only by the skeletal remains of forests and the buried outlines of human settlements. It was as if Earth itself had become another planet, hostile, frozen, and increasingly foreign to the humans who had once dominated it. Colonel Wright noticed my attention. The atmospheric changes happened faster than our models predicted. Volcanic ash combined with unprecedented methane releases from thawing permafrost. A cascading effect. Global temperatures will continue to drop for at least 6 more months before stabilizing. It was the first direct information anyone had given me about the scale of the catastrophe. "How many survivors?" I dared to ask. Her expression remained neutral. "Exact numbers are classified. North America is experiencing approximately 88% population reduction in northern regions. Similar patterns globally with variation based on latitude and infrastructure resilience. 88%. The number struck me like a physical blow. Nearly 9 out of 10 people in northern regions, dead. Billions worldwide. An extinction-level event for humanity. "Project Greenhouse," I said slowly. "It's not just about response, is it? It's about what comes after. Rebuilding." Colonel Wright studied me for a moment, perhaps reassessing my intelligence or perception. "Correct. The project has multiple phases. Immediate survival is only the beginning." The journey to Rocky Mountain Arsenal took less than an hour in their advanced aircraft. a trip that would have been impossible by conventional means through the frozen landscape. We flew above the storm systems, the craft apparently unaffected by the extreme conditions that had grounded all normal air traffic. Through occasional breaks in the clouds, I saw nothing but white below, occasionally broken by the dark skeleton of a forest or the geometric shapes of buried human settlements. Colonel Wright maintained her clinical detachment, answering some questions while deflecting others. Project Greenhouse, she explained, had been initiated years before as a contingency plan for catastrophic climate events, though nothing on this scale had been anticipated. The volcanic eruptions were the trigger, but the climate system was already destabilized, she told me. Decades of warming had disturbed atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns. When the ash cloud reflected solar radiation instead of a minor cooling event, we got a runaway freeze. "You knew this could happen?" I asked, struggling to process the implications. "We modeled possibilities. This scenario was considered extremely low probability. Until it wasn't." She checked something on her wrist device. "We're approaching the facility. Prepare for landing." The Rocky Mountain Arsenal had once been a wildlife refuge outside Denver, after previously serving as a chemical weapons manufacturing center. As we descended through clouds, I saw it had been transformed again. Massive domes covered what had once been open fields. Between these structures, cleared pathways showed constant movement of vehicles and personnel. The entire complex was surrounded by military fortifications, walls, guard towers, and what looked like advanced weapon systems scanning the perimeter. We landed on a designated pad near the largest dome. As the ramp lowered, Colonel Wright addressed me one final time. "You'll be processed through medical, then debriefed. Cooperate fully, and your ranger station contacts will be evaluated for extraction." Her meaning was clear. My behavior would determine whether Reed, Diane, and the others would be rescued or left to die in the cold. The processing center was a model of efficiency and advanced technology. I was immediately separated from my escorts and brought to a medical unit where technicians in what appeared to be hazmat suits scanned me with unfamiliar devices, drew blood, and administered injections without explanation. When I questioned what was happening, a technician responded with practiced neutrality. Standard containment protocols, potential infectious disease screening, nutritional deficiency correction, and preventative measures. After medical came decontamination. All my clothes and possessions taken, my body subjected to what felt like sonic cleaning rather than water, and then provided with a gray uniform similar to what I'd seen other civilians wearing in glimpses through doorways. Finally, a sterile debriefing room where a team of 3 interviewers spent hours documenting every detail of my experiences since the freeze began. They showed particular interest in the strange 3-pronged tracks I'd observed, exchanging glances when I described them. "Automated monitoring units," one finally explained when I pressed, "deployed to track environmental conditions and survivor movements." "Why track survivors if you weren't helping them?" I challenged. "Resource allocation requires data," came the emotionless reply. After debriefing, I was assigned to Civilian Quarter Section C7, a converted warehouse space now filled with rows of standardized sleeping units. About 200 people occupied the space, all wearing the same gray uniforms, moving with the subdued behavior of refugees everywhere. A civilian administrator explained the basics. Food was distributed 3 times daily in the central commissary. Water was rationed but adequate. Work assignments would begin after my 3-day acclimation period. Recreational time was limited but available in designated areas. "What about my people at the ranger station?" I asked immediately. "Extraction requests are processed according to priority protocols," she replied with the same detached efficiency I was beginning to recognize as standard here. "If approved, they'll be brought in within the week." "If approved?" I challenged. "They'll die out there without help." Her expression didn't change. Many extraction requests are received daily. Resources are allocated based on skill assessment, location viability, and project needs. I wanted to argue further, but something in her eyes, a flash of empathy quickly suppressed, made me reconsider. These people were following protocols they hadn't created, managing an impossible situation with inadequate resources. My anger wouldn't help my friends. Instead, I asked, "How can I improve their chances?" This at least got a human response. She glanced around, then lowered her voice slightly. "Skills assessment is weighted heavily. Detail their specific abilities in your follow-up statement, especially anything related to agriculture, engineering, medical, or security." I nodded my understanding and thanked her for the guidance. During my acclimation period, I observed facility operations while trying to remain inconspicuous. The social structure was clear and hierarchical. Military personnel at the top, followed by scientific staff, then administrative workers, and finally civilian refugees at the bottom. Movement between sections was controlled by checkpoints and ID badges with color coding that indicated access levels. I learned more through conversations with other civilians. Most had similar stories of sudden rescue after weeks of desperate survival. All had been selected for specific reasons: medical professionals, engineers, agricultural specialists. There were no children under 12 in the facility. No adults over 65 either, except those with exceptional skills. The massive domes I'd seen from the air housed experimental agricultural systems, hydroponics and artificial photosynthesis chambers trying to grow food without natural sunlight. Other sections contained manufacturing facilities, research labs, and what rumors suggested were long-term habitat construction projects. The truth became increasingly clear. Project Greenhouse wasn't just about immediate survival. It was about selectively preserving the knowledge, skills, and genetic diversity necessary to rebuild civilization after a near-extinction event. A modern ark, but one with capacity for thousands rather than millions. On my 4th day, I was summoned to Administrative Section B for status update. A different officer than Colonel Wright met me, a Major Chen who reviewed a tablet as I entered his office. "Mr. Voss," he began without preamble, "your skill assessment has been completed. Wildlife management and conservation experience are valuable assets in our current situation." I nodded, but said nothing, waiting. "You've been approved for permanent integration into the Ecosystem Management Division," he continued. "Your knowledge of animal behavior in extreme conditions and wilderness survival techniques will be particularly useful as we develop adaptation strategies." "Thank you," I replied carefully. "What about the extraction request for the ranger station personnel?" Major Chen swiped through several screens on his tablet. "Ah, yes. We've reviewed your submission. The military policeman, Corporal Reed, has been approved for extraction based on security experience. The park ranger, Martinez, is also approved for her environmental management background." "And the others?" I pressed, thinking of Walter and his remaining group. Chen's expression cooled slightly. "The remaining individuals did not meet our current needs threshold. Resources are extremely limited. We cannot extract everyone." The calculation was brutal, but clear. In their assessment, some lives were worth saving based on their utility to the project, while others were not. I felt sick, but maintained my composure, knowing an emotional response would accomplish nothing. "I'd like to be part of the extraction team," I requested. "I know the terrain, the exact location." Chen seemed to consider this, then nodded. "That could increase operational efficiency. I'll make the recommendation." He made a note on his tablet. "The mission is scheduled for 3 days from now, weather permitting." I was dismissed with instructions to report to the Ecosystem Management Division the following morning for orientation. As I walked back to the civilian quarters, I wrestled with the moral weight of what was happening. This facility represented humanity's best hope for survival, yet its calculated approach to who deserved saving struck at something fundamental in me. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of 200 strangers breathing in the darkened warehouse space. I thought about Diane and Reed, who would soon join these ranks of the saved. I thought about Walter and the others who had been deemed expendable. I thought about the billions already dead across a frozen world. Most of all, I thought about the strange, efficient ruthlessness of Project Greenhouse, and wondered what kind of world these people planned to rebuild once the ice receded. Would it be more just than the one we'd lost, or merely more controlled? Over the next 2 days, I was integrated into the Ecosystem Management Division. The work was well suited to my background, analyzing wildlife adaptation to extreme cold, cataloging species likely to survive the freeze, developing conservation strategies for the eventual thaw. My new colleagues were brilliant, focused, and, like everyone else in the facility, carefully selected. Dr. Eliza Santos, the division head, explained our broader mission during orientation. This isn't just a short-term crisis. Models suggest global temperatures will remain significantly depressed for 15 to 20 years. When warming finally begins, ecosystems will face unprecedented challenges. Our job is to ensure enough biodiversity survives to rebuild functional ecosystems. "How much has been lost already?" I asked. She didn't sugarcoat it. Current estimates suggest 80 to 90% of land vertebrate species in northern latitudes are extinct or functionally extinct. Marine ecosystems are in flux but showing catastrophic cascade failures as ocean temperatures drop. We're facing an extinction event comparable to the end Cretaceous. The scope was almost too vast to comprehend. Everything I'd spent my career protecting and studying was being erased in a matter of weeks. Yet here, in these artificial domes and laboratories, scientists were cataloging DNA, preserving seeds, and maintaining small populations of key species. Playing God by necessity, deciding what would exist in the world to come. On the day of the extraction mission, I reported to the military hangar as instructed. The team consisted of 6 special operations personnel, led by Lieutenant Adams, plus myself as terrain advisor. The same type of advanced aircraft I'd arrived in was being prepped for departure. "We have a 4-hour window," Lieutenant Adams briefed us. "Primary objective is extraction of approved personnel. Secondary objective is recovery of any useful materials or equipment from the station. Mr. Voss will provide location guidance only. He is not authorized to make operational decisions." I nodded my understanding while inwardly resolving to ensure Diane and Reed were safely extracted regardless of operational decisions. These military types had their protocols, but I had promises to keep. As we boarded the craft, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. The special ops team carried what looked like standard rifles, but each soldier also had a sidearm of unusual design. When one turned, I glimpsed strange 3-pronged attachments on their boots, identical to the mysterious tracks I'd been following. The monitoring units hadn't been automated at all. They'd been these soldiers, patrolling, observing, reporting back, which meant Project Greenhouse had been watching us all along, evaluating who was worth saving, who wasn't. They'd watched people die when they could have helped. The flight back to the ranger station was tense. I sat silently, processing the implications of what I'd discovered. The special ops team largely ignored me, checking their equipment and communicating through what appeared to be subvocal systems I couldn't hear. Lieutenant Adams broke the silence as we approached the coordinates. "Any changes in the situation we should know about? Defenses? Hostiles? Environmental hazards?" "The people at the station aren't hostile unless threatened," I replied carefully. Ranger Martinez and Corporal Reed are organized and cautious. They'll likely have lookouts posted. I'd recommend a clear approach with advanced communication to avoid misunderstandings." Adams considered this, then nodded. "We'll establish radio contact at 1 mile out." He turned to his team. "Standard extraction protocol. Marshall and Chen secure the perimeter. Roberts and Patel handle personnel. Jackson and I will assess and collect materials." I noticed he hadn't assigned me any role. What should I do? "Identify the approved extractees and facilitate cooperation," he replied. "Nothing more." The craft began its descent about half a mile from the station, settling in a clearing barely large enough to accommodate it. As we disembarked, the brutal cold hit me again, a shock after days in the climate-controlled facility. Despite the advanced cold weather gear they'd provided me, the chill cut deep. The team moved with practiced efficiency, their specialized equipment clearly designed for these conditions. The three-pronged attachments on their boots provided remarkable traction on the ice and compacted snow, barely leaving the distinctive tracks I'd followed earlier. As we approached the station, Lieutenant Adams activated a communication device. "North Fork Ranger Station. This is Lieutenant Adams, United States Special Operations Command. We are approaching with an extraction team. Please respond." After a tense moment, a familiar voice crackled back. Reed's. "This is Corporal Reed. Identify your approach vector and provide authentication." Adams gave our position and a verification code that seemed to satisfy Reed. "Stand down and prepare for evacuation. We have limited time on site." When we came within visual range of the station, I saw how much had changed in the days I'd been gone. Additional fortifications had been erected. Snow walls reinforced with branches, lookout positions on the roof, what appeared to be early warning systems using scavenged materials. Reed and Diane had been busy. Reed himself appeared at the main entrance, rifle held cautiously but not pointed at us. His eyes widened when he saw me. "Voss? We thought you were dead." "Long story," I replied. "These people are here to evacuate you and Diane. Where is she?" A shadow crossed Reed's face. "Inside. She's not well. Hypothermia and what might be pneumonia. We've been trying to keep her warm, but our supplies are running low." Lieutenant Adams stepped forward. "We have medical capability on our transport. Is she stable enough to move?" Reed nodded. "Just barely." "What about the others?" I felt the weight of what was coming. "Who's still here?" "Walter and 2 of his people. Hannah, the nurse, has been caring for Diane. And the mechanic, Roy. Evan didn't make it." Adams consulted a device on his wrist. "Our authorization is for extraction of Martinez, Diane, and Reed, James only." His tone was flat, bureaucratic. "Others have not been approved." Reed's expression hardened. "We're not leaving anyone behind." The Special Ops team subtly shifted positions, hands moving closer to weapons. Lieutenant Adams maintained his composure. "This isn't negotiable, Corporal. Our resources are extremely limited. Decisions have been made based on critical skills assessment." "Hannah is a nurse," Reed argued. "You said you need medical personnel." "We have sufficient medical staff currently," Adams replied. Her skills profile didn't meet the threshold. I stepped between them, sensing the dangerous direction this was heading. "Let me talk to them," I said to Adams, then to Reed. "There's more to this than you know. Let me explain inside." Reed hesitated, then nodded curtly. The tension eased slightly as he led me into the station while the Special Ops team remained outside, though 2 members followed at a discreet distance. Inside, conditions had deteriorated. The temperature was barely above freezing despite the wood stove burning steadily. Supplies were visibly depleted. Diane lay wrapped in blankets near the stove, her breathing labored and skin gray with cold and illness. Hannah sat beside her, looking exhausted. Walter and Roy huddled at the small table, expressions grim as they watched us enter. "They found you," Walter said, his voice deliberately neutral. "Not exactly," I replied. "I found them." I explained briefly about tracking Marcus, finding the military installation documents, and the extraction beacon that had brought me to the facility in Denver. "So, they do have safe zones," Roy said, hope flaring in his eyes. I hesitated, then decided complete honesty was necessary. "They do. But space is limited. They're only taking people with skills they've deemed essential." I looked at Reed. "You and Diane have been approved. The others haven't." The reaction was immediate: disbelief, anger, despair, cycling across faces in rapid succession. "That's insane," Hannah protested. "I'm a registered nurse with emergency experience. If they need medical personnel—" "It's not that simple," I interrupted. "They're making calculations none of us would want to make. They have limited resources and are trying to preserve key knowledge and skills for rebuilding after the worst passes." Walter's eyes narrowed. "So, they're picking and choosing who deserves to live." "Yes," I admitted. "They are." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, we could hear the special ops team moving around the station, presumably cataloging equipment and supplies for potential recovery. Reed broke the silence. "If Diane and I are the only ones approved, then we both decline. We stay together, or go together." I'd expected this reaction. "Diane will die without proper medical care," I said quietly. "You know that. The facility has heated shelters, food, medicine, everything she needs to survive." Reed's resolve visibly wavered as he looked at Diane's unconscious form. Hannah spoke up, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "You have to take her, James. This isn't about us anymore. It's about who survives to rebuild." She took a deep breath. "If these people are picking based on skills, then the skills need to survive even if we don't." "She's right," Walter added unexpectedly. "I've seen enough death. No reason to add 2 more if they can be saved." I watched the painful calculation play out on Reed's face, the moral weight of accepting salvation while others were left behind. It was the same burden I'd been carrying since arriving at the facility. "There's more you should know," I said, lowering my voice and checking that the soldiers remained at a distance. "The facility isn't just about immediate survival. It's called Project Greenhouse for a reason. They're planning for a future after the ice recedes, preserving knowledge, species, technology, building a new world." "What kind of world?" Walter asked shrewdly. "That's the question," I replied. "Right now, it's being shaped by military and scientific leadership making purely utilitarian decisions. They need people who understand ethics, community, who remember what made the old world worth saving beyond just technology and efficiency." Reed caught my meaning immediately. "People like Diane, a park ranger who dedicated her life to preserving natural spaces for public benefit." I nodded. "Exactly. The facility needs people who will fight for more than just survival at any cost, who will push back against the coldly rational approach they're taking." Lieutenant Adams chose that moment to enter, his patience evidently exhausted. "We need to move now. Weather models show another major storm system approaching. Our window is closing." Reed straightened. "I'm ready. So is Diane. But I want to formally request reconsideration for these people." He gestured to Walter, Hannah, and Roy. "They have valuable skills your assessment may have overlooked." Adams remained impassive. "Request noted. We'll transmit it after extraction. Prepare the female subject for transport." The clinical terminology, female subject, rather than Diane's name, crystallized everything wrong with Project Greenhouse's approach. These weren't people to them. They were resources to be evaluated, categorized, and either preserved or discarded based on utility. As the Special Ops team efficiently prepared Diane for transport, securing her to a medical stretcher with monitoring equipment, we said our goodbyes. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken emotions: guilt, resignation, faint hope. Hannah pressed a small notebook into Reed's hands. My medical notes, treatments I've developed for cold-related conditions using limited supplies, might be useful. Roy gave me a rough sketch on a piece of bark. Designed for a more efficient wood stove. Uses 30% less fuel for the same heat. Tell your scientist friends. Walter simply gripped my hand tightly. Remember us, he said quietly. When they're rebuilding, remember there were good people who didn't make the cut. The journey back to the aircraft was somber. Reed walked alongside Diane's stretcher, holding her hand as two soldiers carried her through the snow. I followed behind, the weight of those we were leaving settling on my shoulders with each step. Lieutenant Adams maintained communications with the pilot, reporting our status and the deteriorating weather conditions. The wind was picking up, driving crystalline snow that stung exposed skin. The approaching storm system would make this region completely inaccessible within hours. As we reached the aircraft, I made a decision. While the team was loading Diane, I pulled Reed aside. Listen carefully. The craft has capacity for more. Their protocols are rigid, but there's no physical reason they can't take everyone. His eyes widened slightly. What are you suggesting? Nothing yet. Just be ready. I moved toward Lieutenant Adams, who was supervising the loading process. Sir, a word? He turned, clearly impatient with the delay. Make it quick, Voss. The storm is coming in faster than expected, I said, pointing to the darkening sky to the northwest. By my estimation, anyone left here has less than a 24-hour survival window. That's unfortunate, but not relevant to our mission parameters, he replied coldly. I pushed harder. You have capacity. Taking 3 more people costs you nothing but slightly more life support resources on the return journey. That's not your determination to make. Resource allocation is, I cut him off, based on utility, I know. But your utility calculations are flawed. Hannah's medical knowledge includes improvised treatments for extreme cold injuries developed in field conditions. Knowledge your facility doctors with their high-tech equipment likely don't have. Roy has designed more efficient heating systems using minimal materials. And Walter has been keeping this group together, functioning as a unit despite impossible conditions. Leadership is a resource too. Adams frowned, but I could see I'd introduced doubt into his rigid thinking. Even if what you say is true, I don't have authorization. Then get it, I challenged. Call it in. Worst they can say is no. To my surprise, he actually considered it, then activated his communication device. He stepped away to speak privately, but the tense set of his shoulders suggested a heated discussion. When he returned, his expression was impossible to read. Request denied. We maintain original extraction parameters. My heart sank. I'd failed them. Then Adams continued, his voice lowered. Officially. For the record, I'm instructed to proceed with approved extractees only. He paused meaningfully. However, my team has identified critical survival equipment that must be recovered from the station. Retrieval will require all station personnel to assist with dismantling and transport. All personnel will need to board temporarily to secure equipment during transport. I stared at him, scarcely believing what I was hearing. He was creating a loophole, a paper-thin justification that would allow everyone to board. Once airborne, he continued, his voice still carefully measured, weather conditions may make a return trip to the station impossible. That would be an unfortunate consequence of the mission objective. Reed and I exchanged glances, understanding immediately. "I'll get them ready to help with the equipment," Reed said, already turning back toward the station. Lieutenant Adams maintained the charade as Walter, Hannah, and Roy helped dismantle and transport critical equipment from the ranger station to the aircraft. The soldiers followed his lead, though a few exchanged knowing glances. Perhaps even within the rigid hierarchy of Project Greenhouse, some humanity remained. The storm closed in rapidly as we finished loading. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted further. The aircraft hummed to life as the last of us boarded, its advanced systems seemingly unaffected by conditions that would have grounded any conventional vehicle. As we lifted off, Hannah immediately went to Diane, consulting with one of the soldiers who had medical training. Walter and Roy sat quietly, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden transition from accepting death to possible salvation. Reed moved between them, speaking softly, providing reassurance. I found myself beside Lieutenant Adams in the cockpit section. "Thank you," I said simply. He kept his eyes on his instrumentation. "I don't know what you're thanking me for. We're recovering essential equipment and personnel as authorized." "Of course," I replied, understanding the need for plausible deniability. But before I turned away, he added quietly, "Not everyone at the facility agrees with all the protocols. Some of us remember what we're supposed to be fighting for." It was the first crack I'd seen in the facade of clinical detachment that characterized Project Greenhouse personnel. A reminder that beneath the utilitarian calculations, these were still people with consciences, making impossible choices in an impossible situation. The flight back provided a stark aerial view of our frozen world. Through breaks in the clouds, I saw the Montana landscape transformed beyond recognition. Towns appeared as mere bumps under the snow. Forests were skeletal shadows. Lakes and rivers had become seamless expansions of the white blanket covering everything. Occasionally, we passed over what looked like impact craters in the snow, collapsed buildings or infrastructures that had finally surrendered to the weight above. No signs of human activity were visible. No smoke from fires, no cleared roads, no movement. If other survivors existed out there, they were hidden, burrowed into whatever shelter they'd managed to find. As we approached the Rocky Mountain Arsenal facility, Lieutenant Adams advised everyone to prepare for arrival procedures. "You will all be processed according to standard protocols," he announced formally. "Medical evaluation, decontamination, skill assessment interviews. Cooperate fully." He caught my eye briefly, and I understood the unspoken message. We needed to maintain the fiction that only Reed and Diane were authorized extractees. The others would need to prove their value during assessment to avoid potential return to the frozen wasteland. A death sentence. The landing was smooth, despite the weather conditions that had followed us south. As the ramp lowered, medical personnel immediately rushed in to transfer Diane to a proper stretcher and whisk her away to the facility's medical center. Reed followed after receiving approval from Adams. The rest of us were directed to the processing center I remembered from my own arrival. Walter, Hannah, and Roy looked around in barely concealed amazement at the gleaming facility, the first intact functioning infrastructure they'd seen since the freeze began. As we entered the main processing area, a stern-looking officer intercepted our group. "Lieutenant Adams, my manifest shows 2 authorized extractees. Why am I counting 5 civilians?" Adams didn't flinch. Station personnel were required to assist with equipment salvage and transport. Return was impossible due to deteriorating weather conditions. The officer scowled. "This violates protocol. Unauthorized personnel must be processed according to standard assessment procedures," Adams interrupted smoothly, "after which determination can be made regarding their status." A tense standoff ensued, with glances exchanged between various personnel suggesting this wasn't the first such incident. Finally, the officer relented. They'll undergo full assessment. Results will determine further action. I breathed a small sigh of relief. At least they would have a chance to prove their value to the project. We were separated then, each taken to different processing stations. I watched Walter, Hannah, and Roy disappear into the facility, hoping I'd see them again. A familiar technician approached me. "Mr. Voss, you're required for debriefing in Section C." I followed, wondering what consequences might await me for my role in the unauthorized extractions. The debriefing room contained not the team of interviewers I expected, but a single individual. Colonel Wright, the officer who had first brought me to the facility. She didn't look up from her tablet as I entered. "Sit down, Mr. Voss." I complied, waiting. "Lieutenant Adams has submitted his mission report," she said finally, eyes still on her screen. According to his account, weather conditions necessitated the evacuation of additional station personnel who were assisting with equipment recovery. "That's correct," I confirmed, maintaining the official narrative. Colonel Wright finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Voss, do you take me for a fool?" I remained silent. 3 additional survivors, none with prior approval, suddenly become essential to equipment transport during a weather emergency. And, coincidentally, you had just advocated for their extraction during your briefing before deployment. She set down her tablet. "I've been running these operations since day 3 of the freeze. I know a manufactured situation when I see one." I decided honesty was my only option. They deserved a chance, same as everyone here. "No one here is here because they deserved it," she replied sharply. "They're here because they represent essential skills, knowledge, and genetic diversity required for species continuation. We don't have the luxury of saving everyone who deserves it." "Then why am I here?" I challenged. "There must be thousands of wildlife officers with similar skills. Why extract me specifically?" Something flickered in her eyes, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her. "Your specific knowledge of animal behavioral adaptations to extreme cold environments. Your proven survival skills. Your problem-solving capabilities demonstrated during your 18 days in sub-lethal conditions." She paused. "And your psychological profile." "My what?" "We monitored you," she admitted. "Those tracks you followed were indeed our reconnaissance teams. They reported your decisions, your resource management, your interactions with others under extreme stress. You showed both pragmatism and ethical integrity, a rare combination in crisis situations." I processed this revelation. You were evaluating me the entire time, while people were dying. "We were evaluating everyone we could find," she corrected. "With extremely limited extraction resources." "Mr. Voss, do you understand the mathematics of our situation? Global population prior to the freeze event was approximately 8 billion. Our most optimistic models suggest fewer than 500 million will survive the first year worldwide. In North America, perhaps 20 million from a previous population of 360 million. The numbers were staggering, but didn't address the moral question. And you get to decide which 20 million. Not me. Not any individual. The project protocols were developed by international consensus before the crisis, based on species survival requirements." She leaned forward. "This isn't about fairness. It's about preserving enough of humanity, genetically, culturally, intellectually, to rebuild when conditions allow." "And what about basic human compassion? Dignity?" I demanded. "Luxuries of the world we lost," she replied, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. "Mr. Voss, I'm not here to debate ethics with you. I'm here because your actions have created a situation requiring resolution." I braced myself for the consequences. Your 3 unauthorized extractees will undergo standard assessment, she continued. Based on preliminary results, the nurse, Hannah, will likely be approved for medical support roles. Her field-developed treatments for extreme cold injuries are indeed valuable, as you suggested to Lieutenant Adams. I heard snippets of news from their car radios as they waited in line to exit. Coastal flooding on both seaboards as people fled inland. Power outages spreading across the southern states where infrastructure couldn't handle the sudden cold. Food shortages already beginning as supply chains buckled. By evening, most visitors were gone, and the real cold arrived. -25 when the sun set. The radio reported temperature drops across the continent. The volcanic ash cloud had spread faster and thicker than anyone predicted. It was blocking so much sunlight that Earth's surface temperatures were plummeting, and the eruptions were continuing, pumping more ash into the atmosphere with each passing hour. The next morning, day 3 of what I would later understand was the beginning of a new ice age. The first major snowstorm hit. I'd seen Montana blizzards all my life, but this was different. The snow didn't fall so much as it exploded from the sky, driven by hurricane-force winds that bent trees until they snapped. The temperature hit -40 with wind chill pushing it to -60. I tried the radio every hour, but communications were failing everywhere. The last transmission I received from park headquarters informed me that the evacuation routes were impassable. The roads were buried under 4 feet of snow and still falling. The message cut off mid-sentence. I never heard from them again. That's when I made my first survival decision. Rather than attempt to reach headquarters, I would secure my cabin for long-term survival. I had about 2 weeks of food if I rationed carefully. A good supply of firewood, medical kit, hunting rifle with ammunition. Water wouldn't be a problem with so much snow, as long as I had fuel to melt it. I spent day 4 taking inventory and securing the cabin, insulating windows with blankets, moving all food into a single cupboard to track consumption, calculating how long my propane would last if I used it only for cooking. I kept the radio on, scanning for signals, but heard less and less as the hours passed. Just static, occasional fragments of emergency broadcasts, and once, briefly, what sounded like military communications about Operation Deep Freeze. By day 5, I knew this wasn't going to blow over. The storm had dumped over 6 feet of snow. My cabin door was completely blocked. I had to climb out through a window, tunneling upward through the snow like a mole breaking the surface. I stood there, squinting against the brutal wind chill, and saw a world transformed. Everything familiar was gone. The forest path, the fire pit, the woodshed, all buried under a smooth white landscape. The trees looked alien, their branches heavy with ice that cracked and shattered in the wind. The sky was that same sickly yellow-gray. The sun, just a pale smudge behind the ash clouds. The cold hit my exposed skin like a knife. I lasted 3 minutes outside before the risk of frostbite drove me back in. Those 3 minutes were enough to understand that this was unlike anything in recorded history. We weren't experiencing a harsh winter or even a freak storm system. The world as we knew it was ending. The climate itself turned against us. That night I heard scratching at my door. When I checked with my flashlight, I found a park ranger I recognized, Garcia from the visitor center. His lips were blue, his fingers black with frostbite. I pulled him inside and saw immediately he wouldn't survive. Hypothermia had progressed too far. With his last coherent words, he told me the visitor center had lost power. Staff and stranded tourists had attempted to reach the main road on foot. None of the others had made it. He died before morning. I couldn't bury him. The ground was frozen solid, and I lacked the strength to dig through it anyway. I wrapped his body and managed to get it into a storage shed behind the cabin. The whole world had become a freezer. His would not be the last corpse I encountered. I spent day 6 huddled by my wood stove, listening to the wind howl outside. The temperature gauge read -45 inside the shed where I'd placed Garcia's body. Inside my cabin, I managed to keep it just above freezing. Not comfortable, but survivable if I stayed in my sleeping bag and kept the fire going. The radio picked up nothing but static now. I tried different frequencies every hour, hoping to catch anyone broadcasting. Once, I thought I heard voices discussing coastal evacuation protocols, but the signal faded before I could make out details. I wondered if the coastal cities were flooding as people had feared. Later, I'd learned that wasn't the problem at all. The oceans were beginning to freeze. By morning on day 7, the blizzard finally stopped. The silence was almost as unsettling as the storm had been. No birds chirping, no branches creaking, just absolute stillness, as if the world itself had died in the night. I forced myself to venture outside again. To my surprise, he actually considered it, then activated his communication device. He stepped away to speak privately, but the tense set of his shoulders suggested a heated discussion. When he returned, his expression was impossible to read. Request denied. We maintain original extraction parameters. My heart sank. I'd failed them. Then Adams continued, his voice lowered. Officially. For the record, I'm instructed to proceed with approved extractees only. He paused meaningfully. However, my team has identified critical survival equipment that must be recovered from the station. Retrieval will require all station personnel to assist with dismantling and transport. All personnel will need to board temporarily to secure equipment during transport. I stared at him, scarcely believing what I was hearing. He was creating a loophole, a paper-thin justification that would allow everyone to board. Once airborne, he continued, his voice still carefully measured, weather conditions may make a return trip to the station impossible. That would be an unfortunate consequence of the mission objective. Reed and I exchanged glances, understanding immediately. I'll get them ready to help with the equipment, Reed said, already turning back toward the station. Lieutenant Adams maintained the charade as Walter, Hannah, and Roy helped dismantle and transport critical equipment from the ranger station to the aircraft. The soldiers followed his lead, though a few exchanged knowing glances. Perhaps even within the rigid hierarchy of Project Greenhouse, some humanity remained. The storm closed in rapidly as we finished loading. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted further. The aircraft hummed to life as the last of us boarded, its advanced systems seemingly unaffected by conditions that would have grounded any conventional vehicle. As we lifted off, Hannah immediately went to Diane, consulting with one of the soldiers who had medical training. Walter and Roy sat quietly, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden transition from accepting death to possible salvation. Reed moved between them, speaking softly, providing reassurance. I found myself beside Lieutenant Adams in the cockpit section. "Thank you," I said simply. He kept his eyes on his instrumentation. "I don't know what you're thanking me for. We're recovering essential equipment and personnel as authorized." "Of course," I replied, understanding the need for plausible deniability. But before I turned away, he added quietly, "Not everyone at the facility agrees with all the protocols. Some of us remember what we're supposed to be fighting for." It was the first crack I'd seen in the facade of clinical detachment that characterized Project Greenhouse personnel. A reminder that beneath the utilitarian calculations, these were still people with consciences, making impossible choices in an impossible situation. The flight back provided a stark aerial view of our frozen world. Through breaks in the clouds, I saw the Montana landscape transformed beyond recognition. Towns appeared as mere bumps under the snow. Forests were skeletal shadows. Lakes and rivers had become seamless expansions of the white blanket covering everything. Occasionally, we passed over what looked like impact craters in the snow, collapsed buildings or infrastructures that had finally surrendered to the weight above. No signs of human activity were visible. No smoke from fires, no cleared roads, no movement. If other survivors existed out there, they were hidden, burrowed into whatever shelter they'd managed to find. As we approached the Rocky Mountain Arsenal facility, Lieutenant Adams advised everyone to prepare for arrival procedures. "You will all be processed according to standard protocols," he announced formally. "Medical evaluation, decontamination, skill assessment interviews. Cooperate fully." He caught my eye briefly, and I understood the unspoken message. We needed to maintain the fiction that only Reed and Diane were authorized extractees. The others would need to prove their value during assessment to avoid potential return to the frozen wasteland. A death sentence. The landing was smooth, despite the weather conditions that had followed us south. As the ramp lowered, medical personnel immediately rushed in to transfer Diane to a proper stretcher and whisk her away to the facility's medical center. Reed followed after receiving approval from Adams. The rest of us were directed to the processing center I remembered from my own arrival. Walter, Hannah, and Roy looked around in barely concealed amazement at the gleaming facility, the first intact functioning infrastructure they'd seen since the freeze began. As we entered the main processing area, a stern-looking officer intercepted our group. "Lieutenant Adams, my manifest shows 2 authorized extractees. Why am I counting 5 civilians?" Adams didn't flinch. "You're not the first assessment team," Captain Ramirez told me during our final briefing. "But you're the first led by someone who survived out there without our technology. That perspective matters." Our mission parameters were clear. Survey Montana's northern regions for survivors, evaluate them according to project guidelines, and extract those who qualified. We had authority to bring in up to 15 individuals per mission, with extraction priority codes I could assign based on my assessment. The night before deployment, I found Walter in the civilian recreation area. He'd been assigned to community coordination, helping new arrivals adjust to facility life and protocols. His age had indeed proven to be an asset rather than a liability. His calm wisdom provided stability for traumatized survivors. "They're sending you back out there," he said, not a question but a statement. I nodded. "To find more people, like you." Walter's weathered face creased in a sad smile. "Not like me. Not if they're following their precious protocols. I'm only here because you and that lieutenant bent the rules." "The rules are changing," I told him. "Slowly, but they are. Your presence here is proof of that." He considered this. Maybe. Or maybe they're just getting better at pretending to care while making the same cold calculations. He leaned closer. "Be careful out there, Zeke. Not just of the ice. What they're building here, it's necessary. But there's something missing. Something human. That's why I need to go back out," I replied. "To bring that humanity in. One person at a time if necessary." The next morning, we departed in one of Project Greenhouse's advanced aircraft. The technology still amazed me, its ability to operate in conditions that had grounded all conventional transportation, its sophisticated sensors that could penetrate ice and snow, its fuel efficiency that allowed extended operations without refueling. Our first target area was the region surrounding Whitefish, Montana, a town that had once been a popular ski resort. Intelligence suggested the population might have had appropriate equipment and knowledge to survive the initial freeze. As we flew north, I watched the landscape transform from the contained order of the facility to the vast, unbroken white of the frozen world. The storms had continued during my time at the facility, depositing additional feet of snow across the continent. Many structures that had been partially visible during my survival period were now completely buried. Environmental sensors show -72 at ground level, Torres reported from the pilot's seat. Wind speed 28 knots. No visible heat signatures within standard detection range. It was worse than when I'd left. The cold had intensified, and any survivors would have been driven deeper into whatever shelter they'd managed to secure. We began our search pattern, flying in carefully plotted grids while our sensors probed beneath the snow. For hours, we found nothing but the frozen remains of a world that no longer existed. Occasionally, the thermal imaging would detect a faint heat source, but investigation revealed only geothermal features, or, in one heartbreaking instance, a cluster of large mammals, likely elk, huddled together in the remains of a barn, slowly freezing despite their collective body heat. Late in the afternoon, we got our first promising reading. A heat signature consistent with human habitation, emanating from what our mapping system identified as a small hotel on the outskirts of Whitefish. The structure was almost completely buried, but a small area on the roof had been kept clear, likely to maintain ventilation for fires within. We set down a safe distance away to avoid causing structural damage to the buried building. Captain Ramirez and I donned our advanced cold weather gear, infinitely superior to what I'd survived in before, and approached carefully, using handheld sensors to monitor for movement within. 5 distinct heat signatures, Ramirez confirmed. Likely human, concentrated in what appears to be the central portion of the structure. We located what must have been their access point, a narrow tunnel dug through the snow to a second-floor window. Rather than entering unannounced, we deployed a communication probe down the shaft. This is Assessment Team Montana speaking to survivors in the Pine Lodge Hotel. We are here to offer potential evacuation to a secure facility. Please respond. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before a cautious voice replied through our receiver. Who are you people? There's been no emergency services for nearly 3 weeks. We represent Project Greenhouse, a government contingency operation, I replied, following protocol but trying to keep my tone human and reassuring. We have heated shelter, food, and medical care. We're identifying survivors for extraction. Another pause. How do we know this isn't some trick to steal our supplies? We've dealt with looters before. I made a decision then, one that wasn't in the protocol but felt right. My name is Ezekiel Voss. I was a wildlife conservation officer at Glacier National Park when the freeze hit. I survived 18 days on my own before being found. I know what you're going through. We genuinely want to help. A brief consultation occurred on their end, voices too muffled to make out clearly. Finally, 2 of you can enter. Unarmed, any tricks and we defend ourselves. Ramirez looked unhappy but nodded his agreement. We removed our sidearms and left them with the rest of the team, then carefully navigated the narrow tunnel into the hotel. The interior was dark, illuminated only by a small fire burning in what had once been a decorative fireplace in the hotel lobby. The 5 survivors were thin, haggard, but organized. Their leader, a middle-aged woman named Rebecca, had been the hotel manager. With her were an elderly couple who'd been guests, a maintenance worker named Miguel, and a teenage girl who'd been separated from her family during the evacuation chaos. They'd survived by burning furniture, melting snow for water, and rationing the hotel's food supplies with extreme care. Miguel's technical knowledge had been crucial. He'd rigged a ventilation system that prevented carbon monoxide poisoning while minimizing heat loss. As we explained Project Greenhouse and the extraction opportunity, I watched their expressions cycle through disbelief, hope, And then, as I reluctantly outlined the assessment criteria, understanding of the brutal calculations at work. "So, not everyone qualifies," Rebecca stated flatly. "You're choosing who deserves to live." "The facility has limited capacity," Ramirez replied, falling back on the standard explanation. "Resources are allocated based on—" I interrupted him. "The truth is, the project was designed with certain priorities that don't always align with basic humanity. But those of us in the field have some discretion. My team is authorized to extract up to 15 individuals, and I'm looking for people with skills, yes, but also the character to help build something worth surviving for." My candor seemed to earn their trust. They spoke openly about their experiences, their skills, their struggles to maintain not just their lives but their dignity and compassion in the face of catastrophe. Miguel's technical improvisation clearly qualified him under standard criteria. Rebecca's leadership and management experience would be valuable as well. The elderly couple presented a challenge. Both were retired schoolteachers in their 70s, well outside the age parameters of the project. The teenage girl, Maya, had no special skills beyond resilience and a sharp intelligence. Under strict interpretation of protocol, only Miguel and Rebecca would qualify. But as I listened to how the elderly couple had been teaching Maya despite their circumstances, maintaining education and hope in the face of apparent doom, I made my decision. "All of you are coming back with us," I announced, ignoring Ramirez's sharp glance. "I'll code the teachers as educational specialists and Maya as their assistant. The project needs more than just technical skills to rebuild a world worth living in." Over the next 2 weeks, our team continued this pattern across northern Montana. We found survivors in a variety of unlikely shelters. A bank vault where the employees had barricaded themselves in with emergency supplies. A highway maintenance garage where road crews had congregated with their heavy equipment. A small church where the pastor had organized his congregation into a functioning community despite dwindling resources. Not all stories ended happily. We found more dead than living. Some had frozen in their sleep when fuel ran out. Others had clear signs of violence, resource conflicts that had turned deadly. Several times we arrived just days too late, finding recently deceased survivors who had held on for weeks only to succumb just before salvation arrived. Each successful extraction felt like a small victory against the overwhelming tragedy. By our 3rd week, we'd brought in 47 people who might otherwise have perished, some who clearly qualified under project guidelines, others for whom I'd stretched definitions or assigned creative skill classifications to justify their inclusion. Colonel Wright must have recognized what I was doing, but surprisingly, she didn't intervene. Perhaps she understood the project needed this flexibility, this human element that couldn't be captured in algorithms and efficiency calculations. On our final mission, day 30 since the freeze had begun, we received an emergency signal from a location near the Canadian border. A group of survivors had somehow maintained a functioning radio and picked up one of our scanning transmissions. They reported 15 individuals, including 3 children, running critically low on supplies in a partially collapsed mining facility. We diverted immediately, pushing our aircraft to its limit through deteriorating weather conditions. Torres, our pilot, navigated the complex wind patterns with remarkable skill, setting us down just as another major storm system was closing in. What we found was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The survivors had created a miniature society in the mine's administrative buildings, pooling every resource and skill. They'd established strict rationing, medical care with limited supplies, even a small school for the children. Their leader, a former military nurse named Jackson, had maintained discipline without sacrificing compassion. We knew help probably wasn't coming, he told me as we prepared his people for evacuation. But we decided that if these were humanity's final days, we'd face them with dignity. The children deserved to see adults acting with courage and kindness, even at the end. Those words stayed with me as we flew back to the facility, our aircraft filled beyond recommended capacity with these final survivors. They crystallized everything I'd come to understand about what truly mattered in this new, frozen world. Project Greenhouse had the science, the technology, the resources to ensure physical survival. But these people, the teachers who continued education amid catastrophe, the maintenance worker who kept his elderly neighbors alive through technical ingenuity, the nurse who preserved not just lives but dignity, they represented what would make survival meaningful. As we approached the facility, the massive domes glowing faintly against the white landscape, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From those first confusing days as temperatures plummeted, through my desperate struggle for survival, to my current role helping shape who would contribute to humanity's future. The world we knew had ended. The ice had claimed billions of lives and would hold the Earth in its grip for years to come. But in these survivors, selected not just for their skills, but for their humanity, I saw the seeds of something that might eventually be better than what we'd lost. A society that remembered the hard lessons of both our former world and its devastating end. That's why I'm recording this testimony now. Not just as a survival account, but as a reminder to those who will rebuild when the ice finally recedes. The technologies, the systems, the infrastructure, those are necessary. But never forget that it was human compassion, creativity, and courage that allowed anyone to survive those first 30 days of the freeze. And it will be those same qualities, not just our science and protocols, that will ultimately determine whether the world we rebuild is truly worth the terrible price paid for its creation. The snow had piled higher than my cabin's roof. I had to dig upward and then across, creating a tunnel just to reach the surface. When I emerged, the air was so cold it felt like breathing in glass. Each inhale burned my lungs. My eyelashes froze together if I blinked too slowly. The sun was barely visible, a pale disk behind thick clouds. I checked my watch. Noon. It should have been directly overhead, but it seemed dim as twilight. The ash cloud was getting thicker, reflecting more sunlight away from Earth. Later, scientists would call this the atmospheric shield event, the single largest reduction in solar radiation in recorded history. I knew I needed to check my woodpile. At the rate I was burning fuel to stay warm, I'd be out in days, not weeks. The shed was completely buried, but I remembered it stood about 15 feet from the cabin's east wall. I began digging, my gloved hands scooping away snow that had the consistency of fine sand in the extreme cold. After an hour of digging, my hands were numb despite the gloves. I'd made little progress. The snow was simply too deep. I retreated to the cabin facing my first major crisis. Without wood, I would freeze to death in days. I took inventory again. 6 cans of food, 10 liters of water, half a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving for a special occasion, a first aid kit with basic medications, my service rifle with 28 rounds, 2 blankets, 3 pairs of wool socks. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for what was coming. I decided to burn my furniture. First the chair, broken down with the small axe I kept for splitting kindling. Then my bookshelf. I stripped out non-essential wood from cabinets. I burned everything wooden that wasn't part of the cabin structure itself. On day 8, I picked up a clear transmission for the first time in days. A looped emergency broadcast from what sounded like a military channel. This is an emergency alert from the United States government. Unprecedented global cooling is underway. Citizens should remain indoors, conserve fuel, and await evacuation instructions. Do not attempt to travel. Repeat, Do not attempt to travel without official direction. Secure shelter and await instructions. But no instructions ever came. Just that same message, playing over and over, until it too faded into static by evening. That night, the temperature fell to -58 outside. Inside, despite burning the last of my chair, it dropped below freezing. I slept wearing every piece of clothing I owned, wrapped in both blankets, and still woke up shivering uncontrollably. I knew I had to find more fuel or die. As dawn broke on day 9, though dawn was just a slightly lighter shade of gray in the perpetual gloom, I prepared to venture out again. I dressed in layers: thermal underwear, wool pants, 2 shirts, my heavy Park Service coat, 2 pairs of socks under insulated boots, hat, scarf wrapped around my face, the best gloves I owned. It wasn't enough. Nothing designed for normal winters could handle this cold. I knew the risk of frostbite was extreme, but staying meant certain death. I packed my rifle, a can opener, 2 cans of food, and a bottle of water inside my coat where my body heat might keep it from freezing. The world outside was alien. Snow had drifted against the cabin in smooth, sculptural waves that rose 20 feet high in places. The trees were encased in ice so thick some smaller branches had snapped under the weight. Everything reflected the dim light with a bluish glow, creating an otherworldly landscape that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so deadly. I knew there was a group of cabins about a mile south, vacation rentals that might have supplies, maybe even firewood stacked and ready. Under normal conditions, an easy walk. Now, a journey that might kill me. I began trudging through snow that came up to my thighs. Each step required enormous effort, and within minutes I was sweating beneath my layers, a dangerous condition, as sweat would freeze when I stopped moving. I kept a steady pace, not too fast, conserving energy while generating just enough heat to keep warm. Halfway to the rental cabins, the wind picked up. The temperature, already unbearable, plunged with the wind chill. My exposed cheeks and nose began to burn, then go numb, the first signs of frostbite. I covered my face with my hands whenever I could, but it was a losing battle against the cold. I almost missed the cabins, buried as they were under the snow. Only a chimney poking through the white expanse revealed their location. I began digging frantically at what I hoped was a door, my fingers stiff and clumsy in their gloves. After 20 minutes of digging, I uncovered a window. Breaking the glass felt like a violation of everything I believed about respecting property, but survival makes criminals of us all. I cleared the shards and climbed through into darkness. The interior was freezing, but sheltered from the wind. As my eyes adjusted, I saw I was in a typical vacation rental: kitchenette, sofa, small dining area. And there, like a miracle, a stack of firewood beside a stone fireplace, enough to last a week if I was careful. But I wasn't alone. The sofa shifted, and I raised my rifle instinctively. A shape rose, human but bundled beyond recognition. A voice, female, croaked from beneath layers of scarves. "Don't shoot, please." She was one of the tourists who hadn't evacuated in time. Tracy, a photographer from Seattle who'd been capturing fall colors when the cold hit. She'd been stranded here for 4 days, burning furniture after the initial wood supply ran low. She had food. The cabin was stocked with non-perishables, but was nearly out of water since the pipes had frozen. I faced my first moral test in this new frozen world. The wood she had left wouldn't keep us both alive for long. I could take it by force. I had the gun. She was weakened from cold and dehydration. No one would ever know. The thought shames me even now. Instead, I showed her how to melt snow more efficiently for water. We pooled our resources and calculated how long we could survive if we shared one small room, conserving heat? The answer was about 4 days with careful rationing. On our second day together, Tracy developed a cough. By the third, she was feverish and struggling to breathe. Pneumonia, I guessed, or some respiratory infection brought on by the cold and stress. I gave her the only relevant medication from my first aid kit, some cough suppressant and fever reducers, but without proper antibiotics, her condition worsened rapidly. By morning of the fourth day, she couldn't get out of her makeshift bed. Her breathing was shallow, her skin gray beneath the bluish tinge of cold. She knew she was dying. I did too. Her last request was that I take her camera, preserve the memory card if nothing else. There were photos of her family, her children. She wanted them to have those images if anyone ever found them. She died that afternoon. Another body I couldn't bury, another life claimed by the cold. I wrapped her in blankets and moved her to the bathroom, closing the door. The cabin became a tomb. I gathered what supplies remained, including her camera as promised, and prepared to return to my own cabin with the firewood I could carry. That's when I heard engines in the distance, the distinctive rumble of heavy machinery moving across snow. I rushed outside, forgetting the cold in my excitement, waving my arms and shouting. Through the swirling snow, I glimpsed the outline of massive trucks, military transports by the look of them, moving along what used to be the main park road. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the convoy never slowed. Either they didn't see me, or they weren't stopping for anyone. They were heading east, toward the plains, carrying who knows what or whom to some unknown destination. I stood there long after they'd disappeared, my hope fading with the sound of their engines. My fingers and toes had gone completely numb. When I finally looked down, I realized I'd dropped my gloves while waving. Frostbite was setting in. I stumbled back inside, knowing that if I couldn't restore circulation, I might lose those fingers entirely. I managed to save my fingers, but just barely. I plunged my hands into lukewarm water, gritting my teeth against the pain as circulation returned. The skin blistered and peeled in the following days, but I kept all my digits. A small victory in a world of losses. With Tracy's remaining supplies and the firewood I could carry, I made it back to my cabin as another storm was rolling in. The journey took twice as long with my heavy load, and twice the energy. Each step through thigh-deep snow felt like running a marathon. By the time I reached my cabin, I could barely stand. The next 2 days, 11 and 12 since the cold began, I spent huddled by the fire, rationing wood 1 stick at a time, sleeping only in short bursts to keep the fire fed. Outside, the new storm raged with even greater fury than the first. The wind found every crack in my cabin walls, cutting through like invisible knives. The temperature gauge, designed to measure Montana winters, simply read below range. Later estimates would put those days at nearly -70. On the morning of day 13, I woke to silence again. The storm had passed. I checked my supplies. 4 days of food if I ate once daily. Maybe 6 days of firewood burning at minimum levels. The water bottle I kept by the fire had a skin of ice on its surface, despite being less than 2 feet from the flames. I tried the radio again and caught fragments of transmissions discussing emergency agricultural protocols and deep earth facilities. Something called Project Greenhouse was mentioned several times. A voice that sounded military discussed civilian extraction priorities, but nothing about when help might come to remote areas like mine. I knew then that no one was coming for me. In a global catastrophe, a lone wildlife officer in the Montana wilderness would be far down any rescue list. If I was going to survive, I had to move. The ranger station at North Fork was my best hope. 15 miles from my cabin, it was better equipped for long-term emergencies with a larger fuel supply, emergency rations, and better insulation. Under normal conditions, a half-day hike. In this frozen hell, a potentially fatal journey. I spent day 14 preparing. I fashioned crude snowshoes from the remains of my furniture, cutting and bending wood into oval frames, weaving cord across them to distribute my weight over the deep snow. I created a sled from cabinet doors, something to drag supplies without carrying their full weight. I packed every calorie-dense food item, my rifle and ammunition, first aid supplies, extra clothing, and Tracy's camera as promised. The thought of the journey terrified me. 15 miles in sub-zero temperatures, through unmarked snow with only my knowledge of the land to guide me. If I got lost, I would die. If I ran out of energy, I would die. If another storm hit while I was exposed, I would die. But staying meant death too, just slower. I set out at first light on day 15, though light was a relative term in the perpetual ashy gloom. The snowshoes worked better than I'd expected, keeping me atop the drifts rather than sinking into them. The sled dragged behind me with surprising ease on the frictionless surface. For the first time since the cold began, I felt a flicker of hope. That hope dimmed when I reached the tree line. The forest I knew so intimately had transformed into a crystal maze. Every tree was encased in ice, creating identical glittering pillars that disoriented me. Landmarks I'd relied on for years were buried or transformed beyond recognition. The trail markers, normally bright orange against green pines, were hidden beneath ice and snow. I navigated by the sun's position, a slightly brighter spot in the yellowish sky, and by the slope of the land, which I could feel beneath the snow. North Fork Station was downhill and east. As long as I kept descending gradually while keeping the dim sun to my right during the morning hours, I should reach it. After 4 hours of hiking, I stopped to rest and check my position. The exertion had kept me warm despite the cold, but stopping allowed the chill to creep back in. I couldn't rest long or hypothermia would set in. I ate a small amount of jerky, tucking it inside my cheek to warm, before chewing to avoid breaking my teeth on the frozen meat. As I prepared to continue, I noticed something disturbing. Tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, at least not any animal I recognized, and I knew every species in these mountains. These were narrow indentations, almost like a trident mark, appearing at regular intervals across my path. They seemed to come from the north, proceed south for about 50 yards, then disappear completely. No dragging marks connected them. No signs of entry or exit. Just these strange three-pronged impressions that started and stopped, as if whatever made them had descended from the sky and ascended again. I told myself it was just ice formations or some trick of the wind, but something primal in me doubted that explanation. I moved on quickly, suddenly eager to reach the ranger station before dark. By mid-afternoon, I spotted another human trail cutting across my path. Fresh footprints, maybe a day old, heading west toward the park boundary. At least 2 people, judging by the different boot sizes. Survivors, like me, moving through this frozen wasteland. I considered following them, but decided to stick to my original plan. The ranger station offered known supplies. These tracks led to uncertainty. I reached a familiar ridge that overlooked the valley where North Fork Station sat. In summer, this view showed meadows, the silver thread of the river, and the wooden buildings of the station nestled among pines. Now everything was white, the river a solid highway of ice, the trees skeletal under their frozen coating. But there was the station, intact. No lights visible, but the structure stood firm against the white background. Another half-mile and I'd reach potential sanctuary. As I descended toward the station, I spotted movement at its perimeter. Through my binoculars, I could make out 2 figures in white parkas circling the building. They carried rifles. Not Park Service issue, military style with scopes. They moved with purpose, checking windows, testing the door. I ducked behind a frozen tree, watching. These weren't rescuers or park personnel. Their camouflage clothing and tactical movements suggested military or perhaps well-trained civilians. Looters, maybe, or survivors like me searching for supplies. Either way, they were armed and had reached my destination first. I had three options: approach openly and hope for allies, observe longer to determine their intentions, or find another shelter entirely. The light was fading fast. Nightfall in these conditions would bring temperatures that could kill within hours. I decided to watch and wait. Finding cover in a snowbank, I observed as the two figures eventually forced entry into the station. They emerged 30 minutes later carrying supplies to a makeshift camp they'd established in a sheltered area behind the building. They had a small tent, barely visible against the snow, and what looked like military-grade cold weather gear. As darkness fell, they retreated inside the station. A faint glow suggested they'd lit lanterns or candles. I waited another hour, weighing my options, as the cold seeped deeper into my bones. Finally, I made my decision. I would approach, but carefully, with my rifle ready. In this new world, supplies meant life, and I couldn't afford to be turned away. I circled around to approach from the forest side using trees as cover. 20 yards from the station, I stopped and called out, "Hello, the station, I'm coming in unarmed." A lie, but a prudent one. I kept my rifle hidden but ready. Silence for a long moment, then the station door opened a crack. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, blinding me temporarily. A female voice harsh with tension. "Identify yourself." "Ezekiel Voss, Wildlife Conservation Officer, Glacier National Park," I replied, shielding my eyes. "How many with you?" the voice demanded. "Just me." "I'm alone." The door opened wider. The flashlight lowered, revealing a woman in her 30s wearing a Park Service uniform under a heavy coat. Her companion, a man with a military bearing and Arctic camouflage, kept his rifle trained on me. "Check him," the woman ordered. The man approached cautiously, patting me down and discovering my rifle. "He's armed," he reported, taking my weapon. "Wouldn't you be?" I asked. Something in my tone must have convinced them I wasn't a threat. Or perhaps it was my official jacket, or simply the recognition that in this frozen apocalypse, turning away another survivor was its own kind of death sentence. "Come in," the woman said finally, "but know that we're watching you. One wrong move and you're back out in the cold." I stepped into the relative warmth of the ranger station, not knowing if I'd found salvation or traded one danger for another. But I was out of the lethal cold, and for the moment, that was enough. The woman introduced herself as Ranger Diane Martinez, stationed at North Fork before the catastrophe. The man was Corporal James Reed, a military policeman who'd been on leave in the park when the cold hit. They'd found each other 3 days ago while both heading for the ranger station. "We thought you might be them coming back," Diane said, securing the door behind me. "Who?" I asked, savoring the relative warmth of the station. It wasn't exactly toasty, maybe 40 degrees, but after the outside cold, it felt like summer. "Group of men passed through yesterday," Reed explained, still keeping a cautious distance. 4 of them well armed, asking about military installations in the area. Had a map they wanted to compare to our local charts. Diane nodded. They were organized. Too organized for random survivors. Military gear, but no insignia. When we couldn't help them find what they wanted, they left, heading east. That matched the direction of the convoy I'd glimpsed. Something was happening to the east. Something organized amid the chaos. But that mystery would have to wait. My immediate concern was survival. The station was better equipped than I'd hoped. A wood-burning stove provided heat, with a substantial wood pile that Diane and Reed had dragged inside. The emergency stores included freeze-dried rations, medical supplies, and cold weather gear. Most importantly, the building was solidly constructed and well insulated. Diane had been keeping a journal of events since the cold began. Her account matched mine. The sudden temperature drop, the ash-filled sky, the storms of unprecedented intensity. The park evacuation had been chaotic, with many visitors and some staff left behind as roads quickly became impassable. The last transmission from headquarters confirmed what we suspected, she said, showing me her notes. The volcanic eruptions triggered some kind of runaway cooling effect. The ash cloud is reflecting too much solar radiation. Scientists were projecting temperature drops of 15 to 20 degrees globally within the first month. It's worse than that, Reed added grimly. My last contact with my unit mentioned temperature drops of 30 degrees along the eastern seaboard. Infrastructure failing everywhere. The power grid went down across most of the country within the first week. I shared what little I knew. The emergency broadcasts, the military convoy, the strange tracks I'd seen in the snow. Reed seemed particularly interested in the latter. You're sure they weren't animal tracks? Not mountain lion or bear? He pressed. I've tracked every predator in these mountains for 12 years, I replied. Never seen anything like these. 3 perfect indentations, evenly spaced, with no connecting trail. Reed and Diane exchanged looks I couldn't interpret. We've seen similar marks near the station, Diane admitted. Reed thinks they might be from specialized equipment, maybe military drones or monitoring devices. In this weather? Nothing flies in this, I argued. Unless it's designed for exactly these conditions, Reed countered. The discussion was interrupted by a sharp crack from outside, the distinctive sound of a branch breaking under heavy weight. We froze, listening. Another crack, closer to the station. Reed dimmed the lantern and moved to a window, carefully parting the blanket serving as additional insulation. Movement in the tree line, he whispered, multiple figures. I joined him at the window. In the dim glow of starlight reflected off snow, I could make out dark shapes moving among the trees. At least 3 individuals, possibly more, approaching in a practiced formation that suggested military or law enforcement training. The men from yesterday? I asked softly. Diane shook her head. Different movement pattern. These are more cautious. Reed retrieved his rifle. Could be survivors looking for shelter, could be trouble. Either way, we defend what's ours. He handed me back my weapon. That simple act told me I'd been accepted, at least provisionally, into their group. We doused all lights and took defensive positions, Reed covering the front entrance, Diane the rear fire exit, and myself at a side window with a view of the approach path. We waited in silence as the figures drew closer, eventually stopping about 50 yards from the station. One figure advanced alone, hands clearly visible and empty. A voice called out, "Hello inside." We're peaceful, looking for shelter and willing to trade. Reed and Diane looked to me. Somehow I'd become part of their decision-making unit that quickly. Could be genuine, I said. Could also be a distraction while others circle around. Cover the back, Reed ordered Diane, who nodded and disappeared into the station's rear section. To the voice outside he called, "Approach slowly. Just you. Any weapons visible, and we fire." The figure came forward gradually. As he entered the clearer area around the station, I could see it was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, wearing what looked like several layers of civilian clothing beneath a heavy coat. He was unarmed, as promised. "Name's Walter Kendrick," he called. "Got 5 people with me, including 2 injured. We saw your chimney smoke. We've got medical supplies and ammunition to trade for shelter." Reed looked at me questioningly. I shrugged. "Injured how?" I called back. "Frostbite, building collapse in the last storm. Nothing contagious. A quick conference with Diane led to a decision. We'd allow Walter in to discuss terms, but his group would remain outside until we were satisfied. Trust was a luxury none could afford in this new reality. Walter explained they were a mixed group of survivors from nearby towns who'd banded together after the municipal emergency shelters failed. They'd been traveling for days, seeking better shelter after their previous hideout, a hardware store in a small town 20 miles west, had been crushed under the weight of accumulated snow. His story checked out. We agreed to let his group shelter in the station's garage area, separate from our main quarters but protected from the killing cold. They contributed their supplies to the common store, significantly bolstering our medical provisions. Among them was a nurse named Hannah, who treated my frostbitten fingers properly, likely saving me from future amputation. Another, a retired mechanic named Roy, knew how to maximize the efficiency of the wood stove, reducing our fuel consumption by nearly half. That night, for the first time since the catastrophe began, I slept deeply, secure in the knowledge that others were keeping watch. The relative safety made me realize how exhausted I truly was, how the constant vigilance and fear had drained me. I woke to commotion. Daylight, such as it was in the permanent twilight of the ash-clouded sky, showed through the windows. Diane was at the radio, frantically adjusting dials. Reed and Walter stood nearby, listening intently. "Signals coming through clearer now," Diane was saying. "Military broadcast on emergency channels." I joined them as a voice emerged from the static. "This is Colonel Andrew Harrington, United States Northern Command. All government personnel and civilians receiving this message should proceed to designated emergency shelters. I repeat, proceed to designated emergency shelters. The following locations have been established as secure zones with power, heat, and supplies." The voice listed cities and facilities, mostly in the southern states where the temperature, while catastrophically low, wasn't as immediately lethal as in the north. Then, unexpectedly, a location much closer. Rocky Mountain Arsenal Wildlife Refuge outside Denver has been converted to Emergency Shelter Delta. Approach from the Eastern Access Road only. Capacity for 2,000 civilians with current supplies. Denver. Less than 500 miles south. A journey that would have taken hours by car in the old world, but now an almost impossible trek across a frozen wasteland. Yet the broadcast offered the first concrete evidence that organized survival efforts existed. The signal faded before we could hear more. Diane kept trying different frequencies, but the brief window of transmission had closed. "Could be a trap," Reed said pragmatically. "Perfect way to collect survivors with supplies." "Or it could be genuine," Walter countered. "The arsenal has deep underground facilities from its days as a chemical weapons plant. Good place for a bunker." The debate continued through the morning, splitting our newly formed group. Some, like Reed, advocated staying put with resources we could control. Others, Walter included, saw the broadcast as their best hope for long-term survival. I found myself torn. The ranger station was secure for now, but our supplies weren't infinite. The military might have sustainable heat, food production, medical care, essentials for surviving not just weeks, but the potential years or even decades this new ice age might last. While the others argued, I went outside to check the perimeter. The cold hit me like a physical blow even through my layers, but I'd begun developing a tolerance, or perhaps just growing numb to the constant pain of it. I needed space to think, to feel the reality of our situation away from the relative safety inside. That's when I saw them again. The strange three-pronged tracks, perfectly spaced, appearing in a straight line across virgin snow where no one had walked since the last snowfall. They led directly to the station's northern wall, then stopped abruptly. No return tracks, no indication of what had made them. I followed them back in the other direction, rifle ready, breathing shallow in the burning cold. The tracks continued for about 100 yards, then simply ended in unmarked snow, as if whatever made them had descended from above, walked a straight line, then lifted off again. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. Reed's theory about monitoring equipment suddenly seemed less far-fetched. Were we being watched? And if so, by whom? The military? Someone else? I hurried back to the station, eager to share my discovery, but was met at the door by Reed's grim face. "We've got a problem," he said quietly. "2 of Walter's people are missing, along with a significant portion of our food supplies." The theft created an immediate division. Walter swore he had no knowledge of his people's plans, but trust had been shattered. Reed wanted to track the thieves and recover our supplies. Diane argued that venturing out would burn more calories than we'd likely recover. I found myself the tiebreaker in a group that had formed less than 24 hours earlier. "The tracks are still fresh," I said after examining the footprints leading away from the station. "They're heading east, the same direction as that military broadcast mentioned. If they're making for Denver, they're following a logical route. All the more reason to catch them before they get too far," Reed argued. "Those supplies could mean the difference between life and death for all of us." I looked at the sky, still that sickly yellow-gray. "Another storm's coming. I can feel it in the air pressure. If we don't move now, their trail will be covered and we'll never find them." The decision was made. Reed and I would follow the thieves while Diane and the remaining members of Walter's group would secure the station. We packed light, just enough food for 2 days, extra ammunition, and minimal survival gear. Weight meant sweat, and sweat meant death in these temperatures. We set out immediately, following tracks that 2 men had made no effort to conceal. They were moving fast, but inefficiently, wasting energy by trudging through deep snow rather than staying on wind-swept ridges where the going was easier. Their inexperience was our advantage. Reed moved with the disciplined pace of military training, conserving energy while maintaining speed. I matched his rhythm, grateful for a companion who understood wilderness survival. We spoke little, saving our breath, but I sensed a grudging respect forming between us. 3 hours into our pursuit, the trail led us to a small cabin, a hunter's blind I recognized from my patrols. The thieves had stopped here, probably to rest and reorganize their stolen goods. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the bitter wind. Reed approached cautiously, rifle ready. I covered him from the tree line, scanning for movement. The cabin appeared deserted. Inside, we found evidence of a hasty meal, an opened can of beans, partially eaten, and discarded packaging from some of our stolen supplies. More troubling was the blood. Not much, just a spatter across one wall and a few drops leading outside. Someone had been injured here. "Looks like they had a disagreement," Reed observed, examining the scene. "One may have wounded the other." The tracks leaving the cabin confirmed his theory. One set of prints moved with a regular stride. The second showed an irregular pattern and occasional spots where the person had fallen to one knee. The blood trail followed these latter tracks. We continued our pursuit, now following wounded prey. The ethical calculations had shifted. Were we still chasing thieves, or were we now potentially pursuing a murderer and their victim? The food supplies remained our primary concern, but the situation had gained new complexity. The weather worsened as we moved deeper into the valley. Wind picked up, driving fine ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Reed and I stayed close, sometimes linking arms to avoid separation in the whiteout conditions. Late in the afternoon, we spotted a figure ahead, struggling through deep snow, periodically stopping to rest. One of our thieves, moving alone now, no sign of his companion. We approached cautiously until we were within hailing distance. "Stop right there," Reed called, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "We just want our supplies back." The figure turned slowly. A young man, perhaps mid-20s, with a wild beard and terror-filled eyes. He raised his hands, revealing they were stained with blood. "Don't shoot," he pleaded. "It wasn't my idea. Marcus made me help him." We approached carefully, keeping our weapons trained on him. His name was Evan, he told us, a college student who'd been hiking when the cold hit. He'd joined Walter's group a week ago, more as their captive than a member. Marcus, the other thief, had been Walter's unofficial security chief. "Marcus said Walter was leading everyone to die," Evan explained, shivering violently as we questioned him. "Said we needed to make a break for that military outpost on our own, not wait for group decisions." "Where is Marcus now?" I asked. "And where are our supplies?" Evan's face contorted. "We argued after he told me his real plan. He never intended to share the food. Was going to ditch me once we got far enough away." He pulled back his coat to reveal a knife wound in his side, crudely bandaged and seeping blood. "I fought back. Got this for my trouble. But I think I hurt him worse. He staggered off that way with most of the supplies." He pointed toward a ridge to the east. From his wound and exhaustion, it was clear Evan wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions without medical attention. Reed and I conferred briefly. "One of us should take him back to the station," I suggested. "The other can continue tracking Marcus." Reed nodded grimly. "I'll take him back. You're the better tracker. If anyone can find this Marcus character in these conditions, it's you." I was secretly relieved. Reed was a capable survivor, but reading sign in wilderness conditions was my specialty. I had a better chance of recovering our supplies alone than with a partner, however skilled, who might miss subtle indicators. We gave Evan emergency first aid, stabilizing his wound as best we could. Reed took most of our remaining supplies for the return journey, leaving me with just enough for one more day. The calculation was clear. Either I found Marcus and our stolen food within 24 hours, or I'd need to turn back empty-handed. As Reed and Evan began their slow trek back to the station, I continued eastward, following increasingly faint tracks that the strengthening wind was rapidly erasing. The storm was closing in faster than I'd anticipated. Within an hour, visibility had dropped to less than 20 feet. I kept moving, using every tracking skill I'd developed over 12 years in these mountains. A scuff on a partially exposed rock, a broken twig, small depressions in the snow where the wind hadn't yet reached. Marcus was moving erratically now, his trail switching back and forth rather than maintaining a straight line. Just before dusk, though in the perpetual gloom, time of day was increasingly meaningless, I found a blood spot in the snow. Fresh, not yet frozen solid. Marcus was close and weakening. The wind suddenly died, one of those strange lulls that sometimes happen in the heart of a storm. In the momentary quiet, I heard labored breathing ahead. Cresting a small rise, I saw him,